So how do we understand ideology in the public? And well, what we do is we use polling to find out how opinions change over time and how different groups may have a different opinion. So that's through public opinion data. So we're going to look at public opinion data. 4.16. We got three cards for this lesson: 416, 417, 418. So let's look at public opinion data, and then we'll get into some specifics as we go through it. So, one, polling impacts elections and policy debate. Polling done by outside companies, often paid for by media or political parties, impacts elections and policy debate. That's why it's important. If you look here, just think about policy debate on legalizing marijuana. In 1971, it was about 12% of people supported that. But in 2019, it was all the way up to 66%. Well, just that massive change in opinion on legalizing marijuana has made a change in policy. And keeping track of that change, it has been important for politicians to kind of understand that change and then implement policy as a result. All right. Two, the media use polls and polling data to create news. You look at these polls down here. Mara Liasson, who is NPR national political correspondent, put out, and this was last year. This was in 2019. Sorry, she put this out in 2019, talking about the presidential election a year and a half ahead of time. And you just see, like in 1983, Mondale was leading Reagan 49-39. Okay, how did that turn out? Not great. A year and a half before George H.W. Bush, in 1992, running for reelection. George W.H. Walker, Herbert Walker Bush, 51%, the Democrat, 28%. How'd that work out? Not great. And then June 1995, Dole, 48, Clinton, 44. How'd that work out? Yeah, just about the exact opposite. Point is that they use these polls and they go and they poll and then they have this great headline and it means nothing because it's a year and a half ahead of time. So polling an election a long time before the election is mostly worthless other than to create news. So you got to be a little bit skeptical of polling that happens months or years ahead of an election. Okay, 4.17, scientific polling types. Now, polling needs to be scientific and accurate. There's a lot of statistical analysis that needs to be done in polling. So we'll look at that types of polls here. 4.17, pause if you need to. All right, there's just your generic opinion poll. And there are a general type of poll, just some topic of interest that interests people. So opinion polls are general poll topics of interest. Here's an example of election law policies by party. Do you favor or oppose the following election laws? You see early voting. Most of the parties, whether Republican or whether you're an independent or Democrat, support early voting, pretty high levels. Photo ID, 95% of Republicans support a photo ID requirement, 83% of independents and even Democrats at 63% support that. And then automatic voter registration, you'll see Republicans 51%, 58 to 80. So you see it's a little different per party, but overall, most people support these things. A benchmark or tracking poll, that's another type of poll that we'll see, a scientific poll. And what it does is you start at an election or in a certain year, and you ask an opinion, and then you keep coming back and comparing it with that same questions, in a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly kind of effect. So benchmark or tracking polls is what it's called. These are especially used during an election. Benchmark or tracking polls. Pause if you need to. Here's an example of a tracking poll or benchmark poll of Trump versus Clinton in 2016. And you could see how in June of 2015, a year and a half before the election, which is pretty inaccurate, we know that now, Clinton is just destroying Trump. But as time changes and time passes, it becomes a lot closer. And eventually, Trump ended up winning, although Hillary won the popular vote by about 2%. Here's another generic, kind of like a benchmark poll, a tracking poll. And this one just happens to be on abortion and what people think about abortion. And this is an interesting poll because you have three options. Do you approve of abortion during the first 3 months, during the second 3 months, or during the last 3 months of a pregnancy? And you can see this question allows for quite variability in what people think. So as you can see, over 60% of people think that abortion should be legalized in the first 3 months of a pregnancy, but then it drops significantly down to 28% in the second 3 months. And then the last 3 months of a pregnancy, it drops all the way down almost to single digits, the low teens. So you can see like this is a good poll just because it shows us the variability of opinions on abortion. And so that kind of tells us a lot more. And look at the consistency on this tracking poll. They've taken this poll over many, many, many years, and there's a real consistency in the viewpoints on abortion. And then there's a poll called an entrance or exit polls, and that's just asking people how they're going to vote immediately before or after voting. Certainly, exit polls are more popular than entrance polls, but they both, work, and these are done on election day, obviously. So, asking people how they'll vote immediately before or after voting. Here's an example of a 2016 CNN exit poll, and you'll see demographics in here pretty big. Here's the 18 to 29-year-old cohort, which made up 19% of the entire electorate. 55% voted for Hillary Clinton. The 30 to 44 bracket, 25% of the electorate. Clinton, 51%. But then when you get into the older age groups, which trend more Republican, also make up a higher percent of the electorate. Notice is 40% of the electorate was just the 45 to 64 range, and they voted 52% Trump. So you see here what an exit poll can do. By the way, exit polls are notoriously incorrect, and so you have to be careful even if you hear about an exit poll. They just tend to not be super accurate. And then 4.18 polling sampling techniques. So when you sample the population, you have to make it scientific. You need to make sure you do certain techniques to make sure that it's an accurate poll. So what do those things include? That's what we're getting ready to do. So polling sampling techniques. All right. One, a poll to be scientific must be statistically credible. Statistically credible. And that means that it's going to have a random sample. A random sample. That means there's an equal chance to everybody to be surveyed. That's one of the problems with exit polls is that the people are actually standing out at the polling locations, but they're not at all the polling locations. And they might be there only at a certain time of day. So therefore, it's not really an equal chance of being surveyed. Maybe you go to a polling location that's more Democrat or more Republican. And so it's a little harder to get a statistically credible sample in exit polling. Okay, so it needs to be a random sample. You need to have a fairly large population size. N equals number. Between 800 and 1,000 is a typical opinion poll or tracking poll. 800 to 1,000, more than 1,000 is probably going to be more accurate. As you get below 800, then it becomes less accurate. Obviously, like 400 is not good. 750 is pretty good, okay? And the larger, and this is how you know the statistically credible idea, this is how you know that it's been scientifically done. There's some sort of margin of error. And the larger or lower the margin of error, will tell you. Larger, the number of people, that's what that larger means. Larger number of people in the poll, then the lower the margin of error. So 1,000-person poll is going to have a much lower margin of error than a 400-person poll. Typically, a plus or minus polling error of 4% is typical. Plus or minus 4% is typical. So if a candidate is leading by more than 4%, then they're said to be outside the margin of error. But if a candidate is leading by 2%, but the margin of error is 4, well, then, it could be that the other person's ahead. So that's something to keep in mind. Here's a poll, and I'm just showing you the internals of the poll. Internal means who they've, who they polled and how many they polled. And you can just see here the total sample had over 6,600 people, so plus or minus 1.7%. So the entire poll is really good. But then go down and look at the different demographic groups by ethnicity, and you'll see Asians, there were only 355 people polled. So the margin of error is 7.8 percentage points. So if you pulled out of this poll what Asians thought about some topic, that might not be a great poll. That's actually a pretty bad poll, 7.8%. But the other ones are pretty good, the Black, Hispanic, and the white. So that just gives you an idea of the margin of errors and how it can be in a big poll can be great, but these separate demographic groups might not be so great. All right, that's polling, and go ahead and study those, and I'm sure there's some practice for you to do as well.